According to official records, Apollo 18 never flew. Yet inside NASA's archives there are fully prepared human mission plans created for that exact mission. So the contradiction is immediate and unavoidable. Why would a mission that never launched require this level of preparation? That single question is what separates Apollo 18 from every other canceled project in NASA's history. When NASA announced the end of the Apollo program in 1972, the explanation sounded reasonable. Budget constraints, shifting political priorities, declining public interest in lunar missions. The story was clean, logical, and easy to accept. But documents associated with Apollo 18 never fully matched that explanation, because Apollo 18 was not an early-stage concept waiting for approval. It involved real crews, real training schedules, and finalized mission scenarios. One of the names tied to those preparations was Richard Gordon. Gordon had already walked through the complete Apollo process before. As a veteran of Apollo 12, he wasn't an experimental choice or a symbolic assignment. He was one of NASA's most trusted astronauts. And in Apollo 18 planning documents, his name appeared not as a placeholder, but as part of an active crew structure. That detail matters, because it means Apollo 18 was not a mission that might have happened someday. It was a human flight plan moving forward in real time. Throughout 1971 and into 1972, internal simulations, landing module configurations, and surface operation sequences circulated within NASA. Gordon and other assigned crew members repeatedly rehearsed descent timelines, surface procedures, and emergency responses. Every step followed the same rigor applied to missions that eventually flew. And then, without warning, the conversation stopped. Apollo 18 was officially labeled canceled. No press conference followed. No detailed technical briefing was released. Unlike other canceled programs, several evaluation reports linked to Apollo 18 were never made fully accessible. Pause here for a moment. If this decision was only about money, why did the silence feel so intentional? When Apollo 18 was officially canceled, NASA described the decision as a straightforward program adjustment. Budget constraints, schedule compression, a logical step as the agency prepared to move on. But internal engineering documentation told a more complicated story, one that never reached the public. During mission preparation, a pattern began to appear in the technical evaluations for Apollo 18. It wasn't a single failure or a dramatic malfunction. Instead, engineers noted repeated warnings across different systems, particularly within the lunar module's stabilization and descent control architecture. At first, none of these warnings seemed critical on their own. Similar issues had appeared in previous Apollo missions. Sensors drifted. Readings lagged. Filters required recalibration. NASA engineers were used to solving problems like these. The Apollo program itself was built on overcoming technical uncertainty. What made Apollo 18 different was concurrency. Multiple subsystems began showing anomalies at the same time. Guidance indicators reported stable orientation, while fuel pressure sensors showed brief, unexplained drops. Surface proximity data arrived milliseconds late compared to navigation calculations. Individually, each discrepancy fell within acceptable margins. Together, they formed a pattern that engineers found increasingly difficult to ignore. This is where the technical issue crossed into unfamiliar territory. Lunar descent is not forgiving. Every system must agree not eventually, but immediately. When data streams disagree, astronauts are forced to choose which information to trust. And trust, in that environment, becomes a human decision rather than a technical one. Pause and consider this for a moment. If two systems contradict each other during final descent, which one do you believe? Richard Gordon had trained extensively for contingency scenarios. He understood the procedures designed for system failures. But Apollo 18 simulations began presenting situations without a clear procedural answer. In some test runs, the guidance computer indicated nominal descent, while secondary indicators suggested instability. In others, manual overrides resolved one issue only to introduce another. That was the moment when engineers stopped asking whether the systems could be fixed and started asking whether the time to fix them still existed. Internal terminology shifted subtly. Reports began using phrases like compressed resolution window and decision overlap. These weren't dramatic warnings, but within NASA's engineering culture, they signaled tightening margins. The room for error was shrinking, not because the systems were failing outright, but because they were no longer speaking the same language at the same time. None of this appeared in public-facing documents. Instead, official summaries described Apollo 18 as technically viable but strategically unnecessary. That distinction mattered. Viable meant the mission could fly, but unnecessary meant the risk might no longer justify the outcome. Ask yourself this: if the mission was viable, why not explain the risks openly? As preparations continued, some engineers began flagging Apollo 18 as a mission that would test not hardware limits, but human decision thresholds. The issue wasn't whether the lunar module could land. It was whether an astronaut could confidently act on conflicting information under extreme time pressure. That distinction weighed heavily on internal discussions, because in spaceflight, uncertainty doesn't announce itself, it compounds quietly. By the time the cancellation decision approached, Apollo 18 had become something rare within NASA's history, a mission that was technically possible, but psychologically demanding in ways the agency could not easily quantify. And that made the choice far more complex than any budget line could explain. Apollo missions are remembered as engineering triumphs, but inside NASA, every success rested on a quieter variable: human judgment under pressure. For Apollo 18, that variable began to dominate internal discussions more than any single technical anomaly. For Richard Gordon, the difference was subtle but persistent. He had flown before. He knew the rhythm of checklists, the cadence of mission calls, the feeling of trusting instruments while the moon rushed closer beneath him. But Apollo 18 simulations introduced something unfamiliar: indecision created by disagreement, not failure. In several advanced simulations, guidance systems and secondary indicators told different stories. Neither was clearly wrong. Neither could be dismissed. The systems were functioning, just not in harmony. That distinction mattered. NASA training emphasized discipline. Follow procedure, trust redundancy, rely on consensus among systems. Apollo 18 scenarios quietly eroded that consensus. In post-simulation evaluations, instructors began noting longer response times, not errors but hesitation. And hesitation in spaceflight is not neutral. Internal notes started referencing cognitive saturation. This wasn't a clinical diagnosis. It was an operational observation. The workload was no longer just physical or technical. It was interpretive. Astronauts were being asked to judge which truth mattered most and when. Ask yourself this: how many seconds does a person need to decide when every option is plausible? During one high-fidelity descent simulation, Gordon reportedly paused longer than expected before executing a corrective maneuver. The system didn't fail. The procedure didn't change. The pause itself was the anomaly. That pause was logged, not as an error, not as a warning, but as a data point. NASA psychologists had long studied stress and performance, but Apollo 18 placed those studies into a real operational context. The mission was approaching a threshold where decision confidence became as critical as fuel margins. This was no longer about whether the spacecraft could land. It was about whether certainty could land with it. Gordon's personal notes reflected this shift. He described scenarios where the decision window narrows faster than expected. That phrase appeared again and again across evaluations. Narrowing windows meant less time to verify, less time to cross-check, and greater reliance on instinct. NASA had always trusted astronaut instinct, but never alone. Behind closed doors, discussions began reframing Apollo 18 not as a test of engineering limits, but as a test of human reliability under layered ambiguity. Engineers could refine sensors. Programmers could adjust filters, but uncertainty born from overlapping data streams had no simple fix. Now consider the position NASA found itself in. Canceling the mission would appear cautious. Flying it would appear confident. But neither choice could be justified cleanly, using numbers alone. This is where the Apollo program encountered something it rarely admitted: uncertainty that couldn't be simulated away. Gordon never publicly criticized Apollo 18. He didn't raise alarms or issue warnings. But the absence of objection wasn't reassurance. It was professionalism. NASA understood that silence from experienced astronauts didn't always mean comfort. Sometimes it meant restraint. And restraint in this context carried its own weight. The question NASA began asking wasn't written in any report, but it lingered in every meeting. Are we asking astronauts to accept a kind of uncertainty we can't fully explain? By the time Apollo 18 reached its final review phase, that question no longer belonged to engineering teams. It belonged to leadership. And leadership knew that once a human steps onto the ladder, uncertainty becomes irreversible. Apollo 18 was never launched. But within NASA, it was never treated as a discarded idea either. Internally, the mission was categorized as something far more specific: a human flight plan halted at the final decision threshold. That distinction matters. By early 1972, Apollo 18 had moved well beyond the conceptual phase. Crew roles were defined. Simulations were completed. Landing module parameters were locked. Discussions inside NASA no longer centered on whether the mission was technically possible, but on whether it should proceed under narrowing margins. Then the pace changed. NASA is known for slow, layered decision-making. Reviews typically stretch over months, sometimes years. Apollo 18 did not follow that pattern. Meetings accelerated. Risk assessments were consolidated. Some review cycles were shortened in ways that surprised even veteran program managers. When an organization built on caution starts moving quickly, it's rarely because things are simple. Internal language shifted again, this time at the administrative level. Engineers were no longer asked how to eliminate uncertainty, but how much uncertainty could be tolerated. That subtle change reframed the entire discussion. The problem was not a single defect. It was time pressure combined with unresolved ambiguity. Political momentum had already begun to move away from lunar missions. Funding priorities shifted toward new programs. Public enthusiasm for Apollo had softened. Apollo 18 suddenly found itself trapped between readiness and relevance. Ask yourself this: if a mission is technically ready, but the margin for hesitation is shrinking. Who carries the responsibility for the final decision? This was no longer an engineering question. It was a leadership one. In the final reviews, Apollo 18 was not described as dangerous. It was described as misaligned. Systems were close enough to work, but not close enough to inspire confidence under compressed timelines. The phrase time misalignment appeared repeatedly, not as a failure, but as a condition. And conditions are harder to defend publicly than failures. When the cancellation was announced, it came quietly. No dramatic explanation followed. No detailed breakdown of risks was shared. Apollo 18 was simply folded into the narrative of program wind down, but unusual steps followed. Certain simulation datasets were labeled non-reusable. Some telemetry scenarios retained their identifiers but lost attached analysis. Review summaries referenced conclusions without preserving the reasoning behind them. Why remove explanations while keeping the framework intact? This wasn't how NASA typically closed missions. Other canceled projects left clearer trails reports, lessons learned, public summaries. Apollo 18 did not. Instead, the mission seemed to be carefully closed, not erased. Richard Gordon and the other assigned crew members moved on without protest. No public disagreement emerged. But absence of controversy did not equal absence of concern. It meant the decision had been accepted internally, even if it was never fully explained externally. The cancellation of Apollo 18 did not mark a technical failure. It marked a boundary, a point where NASA chose not to test how far uncertainty could be carried by human judgment alone. And that choice reshaped how the agency spoke about risk afterward. After Apollo 18, what remained was not evidence of catastrophe, but evidence of restraint. NASA archives did not reveal explosions, emergency reports, or last-minute disasters. Instead, they revealed something quieter and more unsettling, documents that looked complete, yet spoke carefully. Conclusions appeared without detailed reasoning. Risk summaries replaced technical narratives. Language softened where precision was once expected. Apollo 18 didn't end with a dramatic failure. It ended with unanswered questions. Inside NASA, the mission was no longer discussed as a lost opportunity, but as a boundary that should not be crossed. Not because the technology was impossible, but because the human cost of uncertainty had become too high. Richard Gordon never flew Apollo 18. There was no launch, no landing, no moment the world remembers. Instead, his role became something far less visible. He stood at the edge of a mission that asked more from human judgment than NASA was willing to demand. And that matters, because spaceflight history often celebrates risk-taking. But Apollo 18 represents the opposite instinct, the moment when restraint overruled ambition. Sometimes the most important missions are the ones that never leave the ground. After Apollo 18, NASA's public language changed. Perfection was no longer implied. Risk was discussed more openly. Human limits entered conversations once dominated by engineering confidence. The agency didn't retreat, it recalibrated. Ask yourself this: if Apollo 18 had flown and encountered problems, how would we remember the Apollo program today? Would its legacy be one of courage or one of regret? Apollo 18 left no footprints on the moon, but it left something else behind, a lesson written between lines, preserved not in headlines but in sealed folders and cautious phrasing. Maybe this story isn't about a hidden disaster. Maybe it's about a risk that time refused to tolerate. And maybe that's why Apollo 18 still lingers in NASA's shadow, not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. Now, it's your turn. Do you think NASA made the right call? Or do you believe Apollo 18 deserved to fly? Right decision or missed opportunity in the comments. And subscribe to American Enigma, because some missions never left Earth, but their stories never stopped orbiting history.